시작하면 되겠.
네.
조금
1분
시작해도 되겠지.
네.
보이스 되니? 보이스 해놨냐?
네.
Okay. Yeah. Hi everyone. Hello. Yeah.
Hello.
Nice to see you all. How many students, Eugene, are enrolled right now on the? Can you check? Yeah.
39.
Yeah. As of now, Eugene, my TA is reporting to me that 39 students or faculty members are joining us for this online lecture. Today, my plan is to go through chapter 5, correct? Yeah, foreign trade and industrialization, and get into the sort of post high growth era. In other words, roughly entering into 1990, and Korean economy is running out of high growth syndrome or high growth phenomena. And at some point, Korea was converging toward a slower growth pace. And ultimately, Korean economy is will be faced with financial crisis in 1997. They define it IMF crisis because of the involvement of International Monetary Fund in countries' bailout system. But as you know, the textbook that I gave you, that I assigned, Mason et al.'s Modernization of the Republic of Korea, is ending its coverage near 1979, so before 1980. So 1979 is approached. There was an assassination by one of the top CIA chairman, assassination of President Park. So the first regime, so-called the regime of President Park, was ending. You know, unfortunately, this textbook, you know, it was a joint product of Korea Development Institute scholars and Harvard Institute of Development. So two institutions, you know, scholars like Mason and others joined the group of writing and finished this textbook. But this book, it was covering only up to 1979. So after 1979 story, I'm writing a book on after 1979 story, because I like this textbook, but this textbook happened to be ending in 1979. So, you know, we already have passed, after 1979, almost 40 years. You know, remember, from 1980, right now is 2020. So for almost 40 years has been elapsed. So it is a good time for me to write a book to cover post IMF crisis Korean economy, and of course in English. I'm in the middle of the writing, so therefore, post 1980 period, I have to rely on my own research papers and other scholars' research papers. You know, in other words, there is no single textbook, of course. At the same time, that means I have given you the opportunity that you read yourself reading list, my reading list, which appears in the syllabus. And it's a very open assignment. That is, you choose on your own interesting article of your interest. In other words, I'm not going to assign any specific topic or specific paper to be summarized by you. You yourself decide on which paper you want to submit as a summary. I will show you kind of example of summary reading. 1 or 2 pages enough for each article. And for some students, they may choose 10 articles from now until end of semester. For some other students, maybe 5 articles may be chosen. It is up to you totally. But your summary will be weighted 20% in your final grading. So I will show you later on the example of summary of a particular article. And I hope you understand why you need to summarize a certain set of articles, because we are outside the textbook realm. In other words, after 1980, we are outside the textbook. Okay, so please stay with me for chapter 5, to finish chapter 5, right? 이거는? Okay, we have it here. Okay, we have 이 위로 가는 게 낫더라고. 아니야. 크기하고.
아니 한 칸만 해드릴까요?
아니야, 됐어. 이 정도면 돼. Okay, we are at table 32, but before table 32, let me go back a little bit.
7번 하신 거예요?
응?
지금 22번인데 7번까지 하셨어요.
그렇지. Okay, last time, Eugene is saying to me, we have covered up to page 7 in terms of slide numbering. And therefore, we can start from patterns of export expansion. So slide number 8, please open slide number 8, okay? So Korea was entering into a very high, rapid period of industrialization and export expansion. So they come together. In other words, main items of export expansion for the Republic of Korea during 1963 to roughly 79, roughly two decades, about 20 years, they mainly relied on very highly labor-intensive product, that is using more labor. So at the beginning, but around 1974, they turned around their economy because, as I will explain, you can remember 2 things here. Can I write down here? Right. Okay, so let me explain to you some episode, sort of my own episode of Korea's export-led growth. Roughly, I'm referring to 1962, roughly, through first year of first 5-year development plan, and roughly 1979, I should say. So this is a kind of a episode of Korea's export-led growth. And I want you to remember two things, two concepts. First is so-called takeoff. It's the word given by Walter Rostow. And he was a very famous American scholar. He was basically historian, economic historian. And his book was like Stages of Economic Development. Growth or something like that. And what he intended to do was that he wanted to write something in opposition to Marx. Marx was basically very pessimistic about the future of capitalist system, as you probably have learned from other courses. And of course, Marxism was developed into Leninism and Stalinism, and the current main sort of theoretical or sort of ideological backbone of Soviet economy and Soviet Union, your country, right? Marx was somewhat pessimistic about the future endpoint, ultimate growth pattern of capitalist society, capitalist economy. And this has been recently emphasized by so-called Piketty. Probably I will mention about Piketty's work. His work is 2014, I believe. It's Capital in 20. '21st century, something like that. And Piketty refers to Marx. And Marx theory is basically infinite accumulation of capital. Accumulation of capital. Will lead to destruction of capitalist society. That is a very gloomy path, and the destruction of capitalist society. And the reason is because if capital becomes accumulated as a capitalist society develops, what happens is rate of return. Rate of return go to almost zero. So if rate of return, in other words, capitalists earn nothing because of too much capital accumulation, they earn no money, no income. Then by definition, that capitalist society is facing doomsday. And according to Marx's phrase, capitalist society has no exit from rapid decline of the society economy as a whole. See? So that was the story. And recently, Piketty is referring to that kind of story. So in other words, Rostow wanted to show this might not be the case, not infinite accumulation. And his method of showing, demonstrating, to some extent, Rostow's book tries to demonstrate kind of anti-Marx doctrine. That is, capitalist society may develop on its own, may not go to the doomsday. In other words, may not be destroyed. And he finds this from historical observation. And he says capitalist society is moving from, Rostow is moving kind of pre-takeoff stage. A society typically starts from pre-takeoff stage and moves to takeoff, and then move to mass consumption, period, stage. And this kind of stages theory. And what is takeoff he was referring to? Is typically small or large developing economy. All of a sudden, per capita income increase. And it is not smooth increase. It is like a jump up, like airplane leaving from the airport. All of a sudden, jump, bang, okay? And ironically, you think that every nation can experience takeoff stage? No, not necessarily. A lot of currently African nations, some other nations still do not pass takeoff stage, do not experience takeoff stage. And one interesting observation is that this takeoff stage comes by war or by bad harvest, by flood, or by earthquake. In other words, this takeoff stage typically comes to a nation or developing economy, not necessarily at better times. At times, they come with war, after war, and so forth, or earthquake, natural disaster, flood, drought, and hunger, things like that. And why? Because people, it's a human behavior that if human beings are very much sacrificed, are having hardship, hard times, they try to survive, and then boom, they all of a sudden mobilize their resources and jump. And as you know, Korean economy was under very stagnant period from 1953 to 1961, as you learned. And the Korean economy had to go through Korean War, devastating war. So takeoff stage, before pre-takeoff stage is like, for the Korean economy was like, I can identify 1945 through 1961 was kind of pre-takeoff stage, before takeoff. Economy was not moving, very stagnant, suffering from war, trying to reconstruct, recover, but survival game, basically. But all of a sudden, as I explained, President Park staged coup d'etat. You can imagine the current Myanmar affair. A lot of Koreans are remembering we have had those days, particularly 1980 Gwangju demonstration and incident. We had a near Myanmar situation. A lot of people killed. Still there are there is a historical debate. But at any rate, President Park and his government was able to mobilize resources and put the economy through takeoff. So my estimate in Korea takeoff is roughly around 1965. And my estimate is, for some reason, is widely accepted. And then Korean economy was moving from here toward the so-called 1974 first oil crisis. Staged by OPEC countries. I believe at that time, Russia did not join OPEC, was not a member of OPEC countries. But what they did, quadrupled oil price. Now, I remember this very well because I personally was serving from 1970 to 1973 Korean Navy as a lieutenant junior officer. I was riding, warship. And after my duty is over, we have a 3-year conscription duty. So after 3 years, I joined Bank of Korea. And then Foreign Exchange Department, Korea Exchange Bank, in 1974. And when I went back to my office, of course, being discharged from Korean Navy as an officer, I had to work in the research department of Korea Exchange Bank, which is a foreign kind of branch of foreign operations branch of Bank of Korea, Central Bank. And after I got onto that research team, 1973, I think as I remember, it was in the summer, first oil crisis broke out. Oil price all of a sudden quadrupled. Quadrupled means increased by 4 times. You know what happened? Korea was running very high risk of being engaged in war with North Korea. There was always threat by North Korea getting into another war. And therefore, reserved oil is very fundamentally important resource, reserve oil. And we were running out of reserve oil because of high oil price being 4 times increased, right? So we had to borrow money from IMF in 1974. So I was dispatched by Bank of Korea to Ministry of Finance to join a team, sort of inter-bank or inter-office team, working level, to arrange a lot of loan borrowing, a lot of borrowing from foreign countries. Otherwise, we could not afford keeping oil reserve. And as you know, at the time, if oil price is quadrupled, all the price will be quadrupled. So that's how I started, and I was given the mission as a sort of interpreter and as a translator and a duty officer dealing with IMF mission. There was always resident mission from IMF because they wanted to supervise their funding, their oil funding from IMF, because Korea became heavy borrower of IMF loans. So that's why I remember this period very vividly. So you know what happens? This goes to, if oil price is quadrupled, and what happened is wage increased, and therefore Korea economy was moving toward so-called Lewisian turning point. Okay, so this is by Lewis, Arthur Lewis, who was the Nobel laureate, and he mentioned about this turning point, the concept of turning point. So what is turning point? Lewis was interested in how typical developing economy is moving, from very backwardness, very low per capita income, reasonably high per capita income. During the process, he refers to, in his writing in Development Economics book, they must meet with turning point. What is turning point? An end of unlimited labor supply So imagine typical backward country, not really well developed. A lot of people are laid off, do not find jobs. Under the banana tree, they eat banana. They try to survive, but there is no job opportunity. So that kind of economy we call Lewisian economy. And that kind of economy is characterized by unlimited labor supply, right? There are plenty of people unemployed. You can imagine currently a lot of African countries, some Latin American countries are still having to face with unlimited labor supply. There are simply no jobs because usually jobs are available from industrial sector and they are not really industrialized. But once this economy becomes industrialized, demand for labor will go up, wages goes up. So the economy must meet and pass turning point. And in case of Korea, I'm going to say that roughly 1975. After first oil crisis, because wage rate has gone up, a lot of rapid industrialization demanded for labor, so labor was absorbed. Labor were gone. For example, typically around mid-1970, relatively rich family in Seoul, city of Seoul, they could afford having housekeeper at their home. But no longer in 1975, after 1975, all house workers, housekeepers, usually ladies, were gone to the factories. They didn't want to stay at another house just to earn a little bit of money. They could earn modern labor surplus. They could earn decent income by staying at factory dormitory. So they were gone. Okay. So what I'm saying is you have to remember these two concepts. What is takeoff stage? Okay. All of a sudden, a typical developing economy jumps up. Per capita income all of a sudden goes up. Economy moves from very stagnant state to very rapid growth. We call takeoff stage. And I estimate that in case of Korea around 1965. How about turning point? Yes. But in world history, Korea was the only nation which met takeoff 1965 and turning point 1975. Remember, the time elapsed is only 10 years. How can an economy come through takeoff stage and all of a sudden meeting with unlimited labor supply point, turning point, ending unlimited labor supply? So that means what I'm going to describe to you is that much Korean economy was experienced accelerated growth. So accelerated growth means distortions. What do I mean by distortions? When a baby grows with a appropriate nutrition, baby grows to child, and then boy and girl, and then before adult, and then adult, and then elderly person. This is normal growth of body, human beings. Economy is the same. For example, in case of Japan, I estimate takeoff around 1935 and turning point around 1955. So that's my estimate. And also some other, my colleagues in Japan may join me, and they may have their own estimate. And once, Rostow has also estimated Japanese economic growth, takeoff stage around 1935 and turning point around 1955. Even Japan had 20 years between takeoff stage and turning point. But in case of Korea, it's only 10 years. And you may say that it's good to have a very short period of transition from takeoff stage to turning point. But it's not really good because it's abnormal. That means it's too much accelerated growth, too much intensive growth, too much fast accumulation of capital. So there could be a lot of distortions. So one of the articles which I contributed to Asian Journal of Economics, which is listed, is talking about this story, this distortion. What kind of distortion exists as a byproduct of this accelerated rated growth. So at any rate, I want you to remember two key concepts. One, takeoff stage. The other, turning point. That's very key concept to understand accelerated growth phenomena in the Republic of Korea and in any other nation. Okay. So you may wonder, so in Soviet economy, in case of Soviet economy, of course, development of Soviet economy, growth of Soviet economy did not follow, capitalist society, capitalist economy. So we may not be able to exactly, apply the same concept to Soviet economy. But even if Soviet economy developed in socialist framework, tradition, but still probably some of you may find that Soviet economy had a takeoff stage in 1950s or 1940s. And then you may observe a lot of Soviet workers having jobs, not necessarily large-scale unemployed people. From that point on, even in Soviet economy, wage rate may have been accelerated, grown very fast. That period we can define turning point in Soviet economy. Of course, I'm not specialist on Soviet economy, so I cannot say anything definite, but you may search for your clues. In other words, you may want to find out what was the Soviet economy story, even though, the routine Soviet economy's development is not really capitalist society's development. Okay, so, and then with this knowledge, you can go to various sort of tables, for example. Okay. Exports by destination, for example. What I define this table is Korea's export destination becomes more sort of diversified. So diversification of exports by destination, I should say. How can we prove that? Look at US was dominant export destination for Korean exports, 1954, 56%. Japan, 33%. But by 1976, US only occupying 32%, Japan occupying 23%. Europe has increased its share as a destination of Korean exports. So that means this table shows Korean products, export products became more internationally competitive, accepted by other areas than United States or Japan. Particularly, we can pay attention to Europe, Middle East. These are the third export market for Koreans. Growth of imports, of course. In case of South Korea, always imports was basically resources, intermediate goods, for export processing. In other words, import was somewhat subsidiary to promote export. If they need to import, they are allowed to import. At the same time, they were given sort of import duty payments refund to some extent. So they could easily supply for export processing intermediate goods, buy intermediate goods in the form of imports, so that export could be promoted. So from 1965 to 1976, the rate of import growth accelerated significantly. Several factors explain the situation. First, expansion of exports increased the available resources for imports. Secondly, while the foreign aid disappeared by 1972, other sources have replaced and suppressed it. For example, foreign loans, direct investments, things like that have replaced foreign aid so that more import could be made. To make imports, to buy goods from foreign sources, you need money. So you need, for example, of course, if export is enough, you can always have export earnings to pay for imports. But during this period, Korea still was not in excess of export earnings. In other words, export earnings was always shorter than import demand. Therefore, they had to supply foreign loans or direct investment from foreign countries, foreign companies, so that they can make up the difference between import demand and export earning. Secondly, while the foreign aid disappeared by 1972, other sources have replaced. Third, invisible exports increased quicker than invisible imports. Invisible exports means service exports, things like that. A lot of Korean workers worked in the Middle East, and they were basic source of invisible exports. Okay. Finally, industrialization and growth created a demand for imports, and import liberalization made it possible to meet these demands. So important to note that this increase was still lower compared to the exports, and so trade balance kept improving. In other words, export expansion speed was outpacing import increase, so that reasonably in a short period of time, Korea's trade deficit was disappearing. Oh, of course, except during the oil crisis. In terms of import patterns, one can see the increase in raw materials and decrease in manufactured goods, which is in line with Korea's industrialization. Okay, so now you look at import source, commodity composition of imports. For example, this is not by destination or by sources of import, but by commodity groups. During 1950s, biggest item, chemicals, manufacturers, machinery and transport equipment, these things were most important big items for imports. On the other hand, by 1976, crude materials, right, for export processing, mineral fuels, because of high energy demand as a result of consequent of industrialization, more factories, more commercial facilities need electric power, and therefore more demand for mineral fuels and manufacturers too. And you can see the change in composition of imports throughout this period. So we can summarize the pattern of Korea's industrialization. The notable changes in industrialization patterns include structural change. What do I mean by structural change? Structural change means from basically higher value added in manufacturing. Then agriculture. So that economy is transforming from agrarian society, agrarian economy, into industrialized economy. That's structural change. That's first stage structural change. Second stage structural change is from labor-intensive product to capital-intensive products, and further technology-intensive. And the exports. These are what we call structural change. In other words, from agriculture to manufacturing, that's one structural change. Within manufacturing, from labor-intensive products and exports to capital-intensive products and exports, and then further technology-intensive products and exports. Nowadays, Korea's now Korean exports are all tech items, semiconductor, automobiles, iron and steel, shipbuilding. Right? So this could be another signs of structural change. Items being exported are changing, right? All right. It is easy to observe the decline in the ratio of early industry. So-called early industry is not really good terminology, but early industry means basically labor intensive. Products. We call that as early industry, food processing, textile, things like that. Compared to intermediate products and machinery, Korea still relied on imports to meet the domestic demand for machinery, while 36% of domestic production was exported. It implies while Korea was able to export relatively simple machinery, it still imported more advanced ones. The Korea's industrialization has several sources. The import substitution decreased gradually during 1950s. 1950s. Okay. Decreased gradually, while export expansion increased steadily. Export expansion during 1960s and 70s. Increased steadily. While fluctuating and declining, domestic demand expansion should be considered the primary source of growth of manufacturing output. Of course, domestic consumption increased, therefore domestic demand expanded. So this is another structure of manufacturing, production, trade, demand by major sector. You can take a look at, and you can verify what we have observed by looking at these data. Right? You can also verify, continue for, this is a large table. Production, it starts from production. For example, quickly looking at the beginning, processed food, largest item in terms of composition, in terms of production. In terms of processed food, by 1975 declined. By 1975, intermediate products, manufactured products became dominant component in production, right? Exports at the beginning, 1955, processed food, textile was dominant. But by 1975, finished consumer goods like white shirts, textile, things like that, intermediate products, machinery and transport equipment So you can change export composition change very rapidly. Export ratio, 1 out of D, 2. 2 means how much were produced, how much were exported out of production. Largest ticket item at the beginning was textile in 1955. But by 1975, machinery and transport equipment became largest ratio of export over what? Production. So if production was 100, export of machinery, transport equipment was roughly 36, one of the largest component. And then you can move for imports, and you can also move for the domestic demand and import ratio. Import ratio again, out of import, out of domestic demand, how much are imported, right? By 1955, machinery and transport equipment, out of 100 domestic demand, 70 was imported by 1955. But by 1975, it declined to 50. That means the rest was domestically produced, replaced by domestic production, rather than relying on imports. Okay, so you can interpret these tables. Korean industrial structure compared with Chenery-Taylor norms. What this means is Chenery and Taylor, World Bank economists, for example, it's average of all developing countries. And Korean industrial structure from 1953 to 1974 here. And Chenery and Taylor's series estimates of 1953, 1960, for example. How do you read this table? First, for example, let's take a look at the item industry. Let's see. Chemical and petroleum products, for example. During 1953-55 period, Chenery-Taylor's 0.6 means manufacturing value-added percent of GNP only occupied 0.6%. Okay, very little. Korea was even lower than that. That means chemical and petroleum core products, manufacturing value-added, Korea's standard, Korea's norm was below other developing nations' average. So Korea was far below. But by 1972, 1974, chemical product, Chenery-Taylor average is 0.8, Korea is 4.5. So almost 4 times or 5 times bigger in chemical and petroleum core products. So this, you can compare Chenery-Taylor is kind of developing countries' average composition rate with Korea's very fast industrialization result. You can demonstrate that by this table. Okay. Similar sources of industrial output growth, for example, Sirkin's method of first difference means expansion rate, in other words, growth rate kind of estimate. And I will take a look at machinery and transport equipment, for example. Domestic expansion was about 73% during this period, during these 20 years. Export expansion and machinery and equipment, 3.1%. Import expansion, 23%. And technological change, 18.5%. So the total output increase is 22.6%. In other words, how these are decomposed and make total sum of output increase. Okay. So you can show that very fast industrialization consequence. For example, manufacturing total in case of Korea, domestic expansion increased by 57% if you think of total or direct. Export expansion 8.7%. Import substitution 34.9%. Technological change 1.5%. Total output increase in billion won, 241 billion. So dominant manufacturing-oriented, manufacturing-centered industrialization. Similar story you can check from 1963 to 1975. For example, manufacturing total output increased by 3.283 billion won. Dominant manufacturing increase you can witness. The studies on protection rate show that there was a significant tariff redundancy, particularly in manufacturing. Probably these are very technical words if I have to explain. Protection rate means how high the protection wall, tariff rate it is. It is a mechanism of protecting domestic industry against imports. Significant tariff redundancy, particularly in manufacturing, means tariff redundancy means there is a high tariff in import. At the same time, there is a lot of high tariff in manufactured goods. So that means tariff is almost double charged. Tariff charge is almost doubled or tripled. So that we call redundancy. So the average level of protection were relatively low, reflecting the fact that exchange rate in 1968 was not overvalued significantly. In addition, domestic sales of primary sector had a higher degree of protection compared to manufacturing, 17% to 1%. Why? Because like any nation, primary sector is primarily agricultural sector. Farmers need to be protected from import. So rice import was banned. A lot of food import, corn import, a lot of agricultural import were behind the high ceiling of tariff rate. So higher degree of protection was provided to primary sector. Finally, exports were given a higher effective average protections compared to domestic sales of manufactured goods. So domestic manufactured goods, sales of manufactured goods, effective rate was minus 6.5%. But exports, a lot higher effective average protection. What is effective average protection versus nominal protection. And nominal effective protection by industry group, legal tariff rate. If you look at legal tariff rate, which item has highest tariff rate? Beverage and tobacco. Okay. And then consumer durables like electronics, machinery, transport equipment, all very high average legal tariffs. What is average nominal protection? Average nominal protection means out of this legal tariff, you give exemption. So you deduct exemption from legal tariff. So for example, on the average, Korea was charging 50% tariff rate, but actually average nominal protection was 12.6% because they give back the tariff, refund, exemption. So average nominal protection was a lot lower than legal tariff rate. And what is effective protection? Export and import. Domestic sales. Domestic sales a lot higher. That means domestic sales are behind still higher tariff rate. Exports are giving a lot of tax refunds, tariff refunds. So effective tariff protection of exports is lower. Okay. Table 31, estimated nominal rate of protection by major industrial groups for selected years. 우리 몇 시까지지? 6시 15분까지. Okay. Nominal rates of protection by major industrial group for selected years. If you can see it, for example, machinery and transport equipment, very, very high rate of protection. That means if a car was imported in 1955, $10,000 worth car will become $18,000 in terms of sales price, right? But now, only by 1975, 13.3%. So $100 original price, maybe domestic sales price could be $113.3 only, right? So you can see a lot of import protection was fading away, basically, reduced. So one of the reasons is because to make domestic industry competitive, they need to be competitive. If they are protected by high wall of tariff, they will just persist to be there, being protected. No competition. Then they lose their competitiveness. So to protect that, to avoid that, they reduce tariff over time. Factor utilization and efficiency. As I have demonstrated in aggregate production function, if Y is GDP, that is given by capital and labor and technology maybe, right? So if this is GDP, capital and labor and technology. So when we say factor utilization and efficiency, These are the factors, capital and labor, how they are efficiently used. So in the early 1960s, Korea had the characteristics of labor surplus economy, as I mentioned, before turning point, Lewisian turning point, right? Which could be considered its comparative advantage. Comparative advantage of what? Labor. Their comparative advantage was existing in labor surplus state. The labor intensity of exports, however, declined rapidly after 1968 and matched the imports by 1970. By 1975, it fell below the imports. So, by 1975, what did I say? 1975 was my estimate of turning point. What is turning point again? The period in which rapid wage rate increase is experienced. Because where rapid wage increase, demand for labor will be falling down. Therefore, labor intensity of exports becomes less intensive because labor is cheap, no longer cheap. Labor is getting expensive. So a lot of manufacturers are switching for higher machines, higher technology items. Rather than using a lot of laborers, they try to use machines, automation. So labor intensity should fall below the imports. The indicators imply that Korea exported relatively labor-intensive goods and imported capital-intensive ones. Of course, this in the 1960s. Don't forget that. This happened only in the 1960s. So the findings is export-focused strategy facilitated an efficient allocation of factors, especially considering the rapid increase in employment. And let me explain this. Why export-focused strategy? Why? Why export-focused strategy facilitated an efficient allocation of factors, especially considering the rapid increase in employment. Why efficient allocation of factors? You know why? Rather than import substitution strategy. Let me insert that remark. So let me explain this in this way. The export orientation, and I think Soviet economy needs to be able to export more products, more sort of qualitative products into the world. Why export is so important? Because for export promotion, you cannot cheat. For export promotion, there is less collusiveness, less corruption between industrialists and bureaucrats. You know why? If you have to sell your products across nations, overseas market, it has to be good in quality, and it has to be relatively cheaper than other products. In other words, competition field is not within the country. It is outside the country. So you cannot cheat. Well, you can cheat once, but you cannot cheat twice. There was a famous story in Korea. Once one crooked exporter obtained letter of credit from bank by claiming that he exported stones to other countries, precious stones. But the bank found that his claim that he exported stones were illegal. There were no stones exported. So it's basically, cheating. Of course, he went to jail. You cannot repeat that kind of cheating twice. So who buys your products? Those are smart guys, smart importers. They know which product is cheaper, which product is good quality. For example, Samsung mobile phones. How can they compete with Apple mobile phones? Why did they beat Nokia, Ericsson, all European models? Once or twice, European importers may say that, oh, we cannot believe in Samsung or LG mobile phones. We better buy Nokia or Ericsson model. Once or twice, but that's it. They realize the quality-wise, price-wise, Samsung products may be even better than Apple. So that's why Apple and Samsung are two dominant players, not domestic market. You know what I'm saying? Japanese once were very efficient mobile phone producers. All electronics giants, Sony and all these, Japanese models, very expensive though. But they only adopted Japanese standard. In other words, protocol, software behind their model was not available worldwide. They only targeted domestic consumers. So nobody in Europe bought Sony because Sony mobile phone is not applicable to European standard. In other words, domestic production, domestic oriented market loses competition. How about import substitution? Import substitution, okay, for example, importers are frequently political contributors to the party. Why? Because they need import licensing. They monopolize or oligopolize import market. So they bribe. Everywhere. So what happens? Import substitution policy is inward-looking policy. Do not promote efficiency. Do not promote clear standard. So what happens? One of the reasons why Korean economy was relatively fast in terms of development is because I 100% believe it was due to export orientation strategy. Why? In export market, you cannot cheat. you have to fight against 100 different overseas producers. There is no collusion. You cannot bribe. Well, you can bribe someone in Saudi Arabia and trying to sell your products, maybe once, but not twice, because nobody will buy your products. In other words, why export-oriented strategy worked better than import substitution policy? Remember, Pakistan, India were following import substitution strategy. And that's why they were late in industrialization. They were late in lifting up their per capita income. Now India is desperate in export orientation. Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, 4 tigers, all devoted their effort for export promotion. How did they succeed? Because there is no cheating. You cannot cheat. So I truly believe even Soviet economy, the modern version, modern Soviet highly developed economy, you have a lot of resources in agricultural products, mineral products. A lot of resources, very resource-rich country, Soviet economy. You have to develop export market. You have to be able to sell your products overseas market. Why? That way, Soviet economy, industries can be further modernized, more technology-intensive industries. So the findings, export-focused strategy rather than import substitution strategy facilitated an efficient allocation of factors, especially considering the rapid increase in employment. The rise of wage-rental ratio accelerated the capital accumulation, replacing the labor in production. Turning point theory is one demonstration of this argument. This, however, did not result in a waste of resources, as the capital utilization rate also has grown to match the increase. So this is a kind of, factor intensity of production by commodity category. It's a little bit technically difficult, but to understand, but not that much difficult. I will try to explain so that you can understand this table. Okay, this is a little bit more high-level economics. But estimates of labor capital ratio by Westphal and Kim, 2 economists, Westphal and Kim, they estimated labor and capital ratio required to produce 1 unit of, for example, primary products, manufacturing products, and so forth. So to let you understand, let me see manufacturing, focus on manufacturing, right? Let me focus manufacturing exports. Previously, 1960, labor divided by capital ratio. In other words, per 1 unit of factory, how many people worked on manufacturing export, for example? 1 factory, 1 unit of machine, 2.72 people. Exports, but exports by 1968 became more labor intensive. Why? Higher rate, more people worked per machine. That means during this period, Korea was exporting a lot of labor-intensive products. Do you remember that? White shirts, textile, labor-intensive products. So labor capital ratio is increasing. How about in imports? In imports, labor in capital ratio also increasing. Okay, so you can see this, but at the same time, labor capital rates by Hong, Professor Hong, who was one of my senior professor, according to his estimate, for example, direct factor requirements and total factor requirements, and I will explain what is direct factor requirements and total factor requirements. For example, in automobile making, if you have automobile manufacturer, there must be capital and labor. Suppose that automobile manufacturer have 10,000 laborers and so much machine. That's 10,000 labor are direct factor requirements. What is total factor requirements? Direct plus indirect factor requirements. What is that? It's a little bit technically difficult concept, but to make automobile, you need to put tire. Now, automobile maker are buying tire as a component. And tire is made by laborers and capital. So you have to add indirect factor requirement. In other words, labor required to produce 1 unit of tire should be also added. That's total factor requirement. Again, in total factor requirements during this period, you can see, for example, one example is very important here, the last row, which demonstrates labor divided by capital ratio declined rapidly. Exports from 1.4 to 0.32. So as you move to by 1975, Korean exports became more capital intensive, more labor, lower labor capital ratio becomes more capital intensive. Okay, do you understand that? Right. You can look at this labor capital ratio by Hong shows 1963, 1.4 for export products. By 1975, 0.32. So that means per one machine, by 1963, 1.4 people worked on that machine. By 1975, only 0.3 people working hours was devoted to exports. So you can say that you can interpret this ratio declining means labor capital declining, that means capital labor increasing. Reciprocal of this ratio, capital labor increasing. So capital intensity increasing. Okay. So let me just show you the summary. Okay. We are almost at the end of today's class, but I want to share a typical summary. Can you open up the? Okay, this is the topic that I will share. Lucas' paper, Making a Miracle. You know, briefly, if I introduce, very famous economist Robert Lucas of University of Chicago, Nobel Prize winner. And he was frequently making trips to Seoul, Korea, our university, Seoul National University. I used to sit down with the dinner, to have dinner with Professor Lucas. We enjoyed a lot of his remarks and his address and so forth. As I remember, he was one of the chain smoker. He always smoked a lot of tobaccos, as I remember. But maybe by now, not any longer. But at any rate, this is a very famous article, Making a Miracle. I want you to read, every one of you, because I sent you PDF for his article. And this is a typical summary of his article. You don't have to repeat this article summary, but this is just a demonstration. You see? So I want you to summarize your own. The second is Alvin Young, 1994 article. He was another very famous economist. I think he's right now in Boston. I was invited to Harvard's growth seminar by Barrow, and I was supposed to be discussant on his paper. And that's why it was about 1997, 1998, after he wrote this article. So that's how I remember Alvin Young. And please read his article too, if you can. The more articles you read and summarize, of course, you are getting more credits. Okay, let's say, for example, suppose the norm is 10 articles summarized. Each has 2 points. If you submit 10 article summary, you fulfill 20 points. If you submit 4 article summary, 8 points out of 20, okay? So I want you to read as many articles as possible. Because why? Because you have no textbook after 1979. Okay, you must read articles. Okay, that ends today's class, and let me open for your comments and question and answer.
I have a question.
Okay.
Evgeny Tищенко,
Who is this?
Evgeny Tищенko, PhD
Okay.
student. How Korean government balanced trade surplus, combining import liberalization on the one side with strict protectionist measures on the other?
Mm-hmm. So import liberalization could not be maintained unless there is continuous increase in export earnings. A continuous increase in export earnings, as I explained, as a consequence of successful industrialization. After, for example, 1974 oil crisis, they knew that wage rate is very high, so they quickly moved from labor-intensive exports into capital-intensive exports, like automobiles, shipbuilding. So that continuous export earnings made import liberalization by government possible, right? By liberalizing imports, there will be an influx of imports, right? Now, how can you afford a lot of importation of imports? You must have high level of export earnings to finance import. Okay, that's the story. Any other question?
Yes.
Okay.
I have one question.
Oh, Christina.
Yes.
Christina.
I want to make it more clear what's the reason of the rapid growth of export in Korea in the period of the 1960 by 1975.
Did you ask? Could you repeat your question?
I want to make more clear what the exact reason of the rapid growth of the export in Korea in the period of 1960 by or to
Yeah.
1975.
Right. Again, as I explained, 1950s Korean economy was very stagnant, but the typical takeoff has occurred. Takeoff means that stagnant economy all of a sudden industrializing very rapidly. Okay, so the economic movement is jumping up. Okay, around 1965. It happened because, first of all, the government was desperate in moving toward industrialization because President Park government did not have legitimacy. As I explained, President Park's government was staged on the stage by coup d'etat, like Myanmar situation. And to justify their action, coup d'etat, they needed to achieve some goal. The goal is economic lift up, take off. And therefore they put all the resources. And one of the resources was diplomatic relationship being established between Korea and Japan. Getting war reparation money, they could build important factory like POSCO, Korea Pohang Steel Company. Highway, putting highway money into highway between Seoul and Busan. All these infrastructure and factories were built out of money from Japan and US aid or World Bank, IMF loans. So it's the government, role of the government, how to put all these resources into needed sector and make the economy fly, jump up. Okay. Okay,
Thank you.
Because of this opportunity, I want you to read Krugman, Lucas. Can I write somewhere? Chatting message? Maybe you're chatting, right?
Yeah, question. I have a question.
Yeah, later. Let me chat. Lucas, Krugman, 표, papers. Okay. All right. To be prepared for next week lecture. Any other question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, you had a question.
Um, while the car imports fell, Korea continued to rely on import to meet domestic demand. And why did it still rely on import?
Okay, to manufacture some goods and equipments, for example, domestic resources are not enough. For example, you need to have you want to export one automobile, for example, key products, key intermediate goods may have to be imported. And Korea imported a lot of Japanese-made intermediate goods, like a little semiconductor at the time, and also a lot of, for example, parts and components from Japanese side, like Toyota or Nissan made parts and components, because domestic market is not big enough. Therefore, there is no scale economies. So they have to be able to export good products. They need to import a lot of good imports as ingredients, as parts and components of your export products. That's why utilization of good import sources are very important. Right.
I think could this have been a policy of protectionism?
I didn't understand you. Could you repeat again?
Could have been a policy of protectionism.
Okay. So policy of protectionism is basically there are two kinds of protectionism. One, by tariff, impose tax on imports, right? Tariff. The other is non-tariff barriers. We call in abbreviation NTB, non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers is something like this. Okay, you industrialists, you cannot import this product. For example, import ban, prohibition of import is another non-tariff barriers. Or rice, in case of Korean. Okay, you can import rice a certain amount, million tons. So we call that as quantitative restriction. It's non-tariff barriers. So there could be both tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. Korea tried to reduce those tariff barriers over time, particularly after 1975. The reason is because if you keep protecting domestic industries by high ceiling of tariff, they are not becoming good exporter. They are not good industrial companies. So to promote their competitiveness, in other words, you have to compete like in students' affairs. If you take entrance examination, let's say Tomsk High School can only enter into Tomsk University, no competition. But Tomsk University, to get into Tomsk University, you need to compete with other high school students. Not only Tomsk High School, but also Irkutsk High School students, Khabarovsk High School students. Then Tomsk University becomes very competitive, right? The same. Imports needs to be competitive imports. Okay?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other question?
Professor, I've got one more question.
Okay. Who is this?
My name is Lina. I'm from Thompson
Oh.
State University.
Ekaterina.
No, Lina.
Nina. Oh, I don't see you on the picture. Okay, but okay. I see you. All right, Nina. All right. Welcome.
Okay. At the end of the lecture, you mentioned essays that we need to write and then send them all to you. So could you please tell me what is the deadline of our first essays and what is the most suitable length for them? 1 page or maybe 2 pages?
Okay. Could you repeat your question again? Could you repeat?
Okay, so I wonder whether there is some deadline of our first essays to any article we have read. So,
Oh, Luis, okay. Unfortunately, I did not send his book in PDF format. If I find it, maybe a few pages about turning point concept, I may be able, I hope I may be able to later send you by sort of, let's see, by PDF file. But Luis is very famous economist, of course, Nobel Prize winner. And he writes about a lot of development economics, okay? And as you mentioned, his concept of turning point is coming from his book, but the book is just too thick, so I did not bother, printing it out. But I think you may be able to find it from your library. If not, I will try to send a couple of pages of his book in PDF file, referring to turning point concept. Now, here's a very famous story. Luis has been always arguing that human capital investment is the best investment. And he demonstrates that. He said a lot of African countries received loans from IMF and World Bank in building electric power plants. They said that we need electric power, and they borrowed tons of money, a lot of money, to build electric power plants. And Luis has been arguing that, no, it's better to build elementary schools, educational facility, rather than power plants. Why? There are no engineers who can maintain the power plant. After 3 or 4 years, the power plant becomes rustic, old-fashioned. No engineers are there to maintain the power plant. So he was always arguing against those types of international loans. You better buy, you better build elementary schools in that country so that kids can learn how to read, how to write, how to communicate, and let them move on to middle school and high school so that they become engineers and can maintain the factory. In other words, Luis was very famous in terms of arguing for human capital buildup is most important. The same might be true in Soviet economy. You need to build higher human capital because it's technology war. Worldwide, we are engaged into fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, a lot of things. I know Soviet economy has a very high-powered human capital. You have the resources. But probably most of that human capital were utilized for military purpose, not commercialized human capital. But military goods, you cannot sell overseas that much military goods. You can only sell commercial goods, commercial technology, innovation. So it's human capital in our head, the resources. So maybe even your country, Soviet Union, needs to upgrade education, human capital. South Korea is also known for good human capital, but it is converging. Not anymore. We lack a lot of high-speed investment into human capital. Korean colleges, universities are not good enough, are not that high level, because we are lacking investment into college and universities. You see, only frontier nation remains. There is no second backup, no followers. For example, I was making comments with my Japanese friends, Japanese scholars. Why Amazon, Apple, all these so-called high-tech companies are located in the United States? Why not in West Germany? Well, I mean Germany. Why not in France? Why not in Japan? You know why? Because not only scale economies, still US is the most open job market. Internationally famed students, brilliant students, all gather into US job market. They fight against each other. Still, there is less discrimination in US market. You know, last 40 years, I have been teaching in Seoul National University, top 10 students who went to US universities. They survived there. They get a job at Princeton, Harvard University, or something like that. And then after several years, they return to Seoul. I like them to be trained in the United States. But when I sent top 10 students to Europe, London or France, Sorbonne, or those top universities, they don't survive there. Europeans still discriminate a lot more than Americans. They are kicked out. They, have to return to Seoul, Korea. They are not surviving in Paris. They are not surviving in Frankfurt, but they are surviving in Boston, in Harvard, in Princeton, in the United States, in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. A lot of Korean scientists, Korean scholars are surviving there. Indian scholars are surviving there. Then much still US job market was open. So open competition promotes industry. That's what it is. That's why, Japan still very dominant technology leader. They have a lot of low Nobel Prize winners, but still their job market, their labor market are not that open. So less competition. Therefore, they become followers to US leaders. The same is true with the South Korean. Any other question?
Yes, hello dear professor.
Constantine? Cornel? Yeah.
My name is Constantine. I am the student of Gdańsk State University.
Oh.
So the question is, I would like to know your opinion. Why current developing countries cannot implement the export-oriented experience of the South Korea? Just they cannot repeat the success of Korea or the South Korea and Japan, for example.
Oh,
why
yeah,
they?
Yeah,
able to do it?
that's a very good question. Repeat, or we call replication, kind of learning by doing or learning by experiencing. To some extent, I think South Korea learned from Japan the industrialization experience and the system, the role of government and things like that a lot. But at the same time, Korea learned from United States another flow of human capital, another flow of capital, another flow of technology. So in other words, Korean system could be sort of developed by imitating, importing a lot of technology, not only from Japan, but also American side, and also some European side. In other words, it's kind of mixed combination of technologies in Korean market. And the technological adoption is also know-how. If you do not have knowledge, if you do not have human capital, you don't know which brand technology is best. Ericsson technology, Nokia technology, or Sony technology, or Intel technology, which technology you're gonna import? Unless you know, unless you have a brain, unless you have a human capital. So that's why human capital education is so important, because you have to know which technology you have to adopt out of 10 different technologies, right? So ultimately, it's the question of that country's human capital. And that's why I ask you to read Lucas. Lucas was comparing Korea with the Philippines in 1960s, early 1960s. Two nations started the race for industrialization only almost at equal level. the same elementary school enrollment ratio, very similar per capita income, very heavy reliance on agricultural sector. Everything was almost the same. But Lucas was questioning to himself, after 30 years, why one nation, South Korea, is almost at the entrance level of advanced economies? Why Philippines, after 30 years, still lagging behind? Why per capita income Korea is all approaching $200,000? I mean, $20,000. Philippines still $5,000. He was questioning himself. And he was saying that even if I'm growth theorist, I don't know. I don't know the reason. But he ultimately answered by saying that if you read Lucas' paper tonight, you will understand what I'm saying. He said it's human capital. And the system which utilizes human capital. You see, in case of the Philippines, there is so-called gated community. If you see the street of Manila, you go there, the rich people are behind the wall of gates, so-called gated community. So what is that? Philippines as a society was very non-egalitarian. High-class people, low-class people, very much income distribution polarized, so-called marginalized, polarized society. Under that setting, human capital cannot move on. Compared to that, South Korean economy, there were no rich gated community. There were no gates. Mr. Kim is the same as Mr. Lee. Mr. Kim's family has better students at better schools, then Mr. Kim's family is better reputable family, regarded high-class people. If your students, your children do not go to good college and good university, your family is regarded lower hand. That kind of social spirit is inevitable to promote human capital. So, please read Lucas' paper and Krugman paper to help your understanding of my next lecture. Okay? Thank you for your attention, and I'll stop here for today. And let me see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, Paulina, who is this? Another question? Well, we are past due time by more than half an hour. So I will have to stop today and let us continue our discussion next week. Okay? Thank you very much.